What's your call sign, sweetheart? They give you one for pushing boxes. Rear Admiral Thomas Vance said it loud, loud enough for every SEAL in that corridor to hear. And then he laughed a hard public laugh that was designed to humiliate, designed to diminish, designed to remind everyone watching exactly where this woman stood in his world. His men laughed with him because that is what men do when the most powerful person in the room decides someone is a joke. She stood completely still. She did not flinch. She did not look down. She looked directly at the Admiral and said two words that drained every sound from that hallway. Subscribe, drop your city below, and stay until the end. Before you hear what happened next, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell and drop the name of your city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Stay with me until the very end. You will not regret it. The morning felt like every other morning at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. The California sun was already climbing. Seagulls cut across the pale blue sky over the Pacific. Somewhere on the training grounds, a group of SEAL candidates was finishing a punishment run they'd earned by mouthing off to an instructor at 6 a.m. The base had its own heartbeat, disciplined, relentless, proud. It was the kind of place where men walked with intention and spoke with precision, where medals on a chest told a story before a single word left a man's mouth. Nobody paid much attention to the woman pushing the equipment cart down Corridor 7. She was unremarkable in every way that the base had been trained to value. No uniform, no rank insignia, no combat ribbons. She wore a plain civilian work shirt, dark slacks that had seen too many washings, and a laminated logistics badge clipped to her front pocket. Her brown hair was pulled back without ceremony. Her boots, the one concession to practicality, were well-worn and flat-soled. She moved quietly. She moved efficiently. She did not look left or right the way someone seeking attention might. She simply moved, guiding the heavy SEAL communications cases along the corridor with the steady, unhurried motion of someone who had been doing physical work for a very long time. Her name tag read, Hail our Civilian Logistics Technician. Her name was Rebecca, and on any other morning, she would have loaded the cases into the secure transport bay, signed the inventory sheet, gotten back into her beat-up Honda, and driven home to make her brother's noon medications before his physical therapy appointment. But this was not any other morning, because at 0847, Rear Admiral Thomas Vance came around the corner with an entourage. I was not a small presence. Thomas Vance was the kind of man who had never needed to try very hard to dominate a room because rooms had always simply rearranged themselves around him. 6'2", silver-haired, decorated in ways that took up real estate on a dress uniform. He had commanded 2 SEAL teams, overseen 3 combat rotations, and was currently the senior officer at Naval Special Warfare Command's West Coast operations. He was brilliant, he was experienced, he was respected by the right people and feared by the useful ones. I was also on this particular morning in an exceptionally good mood. Behind him walked Commander Daniel Mercer, veteran SEAL instructor. Quiet, observant, the kind of man who analyzed people the way others analyze maps. Beside Mercer walked Master Chief Owen Briggs, 52 years old, built like a hardware store with eyes that had seen things that would end ordinary men's sleep permanently. And trailing behind them, clustered in a tight pack of freshly qualified confidence, were 6 of the newest SEAL officers the program had produced. Lieutenant Ryan Cole led that group, 29 years old, top of his cohort, the kind of handsome that doors opened for, and the kind of smart that made him dangerously certain he already knew everything worth knowing. They were mid-conversation, something about a scheduling conflict for the fall training rotation, when the young officer at the front of the group turned a corner without looking and nearly walked directly into Rebecca's equipment cart. The sealed communications case on top wobbled. It was going to fall. $340 of electronics, plus a classified frequency sync module, plus the glass face pressure gauge on the left side that maintenance had been waiting 6 weeks to replace. And then Rebecca's hand shot out. Not quickly in the way someone startled might grab frantically, clumsily, the way civilians moved, when something surprised them. Quickly in the way that told everyone who saw it that her nervous system had decided on a response before her conscious mind had even registered the problem. The case snapped back into level. Not a tremor, not a fumble. She simply corrected it the way a surgeon returns a slipped instrument to position and set it back down without looking at it. The young officer blinked. "Sorry about that," he managed. "No harm done. Rebecca said simply. She didn't look annoyed. She didn't look rattled. She looked exactly the same as she had looked 10 seconds earlier. Admiral Vance had stopped walking. He was watching her. His first instinct, the instinct of a man who had spent 3 decades building the finest warriors in the American military, was to notice the quality of that movement, the speed, the decisiveness, the complete absence of wasted motion. Most people, when a heavy object fell unexpectedly, either dove for it or flinched away. Rebecca Hale had done neither. She had simply put her body where the problem was efficiently and without drama and solved it. His second instinct, the instinct of a man who had gotten very comfortable being the most important person in every room he walked into, was to make it entertaining. He glanced at the men around him. Mercer was watching the woman. Briggs was watching the woman. The young officers were watching Vance for a signal on how to react. Vance smiled. "Careful there," he said, his voice carrying the easy warmth of someone who had never had to worry about whether his jokes landed. "You move like one of my operators." Several of the junior officers laughed. It was the kind of laugh that lives somewhere between genuine amusement and political survival. Rebecca looked at the Admiral. Her expression was neutral, professionally neutral, in the way that wasn't quite blank, the way that someone's face gets when they have made a deliberate decision not to react to something. "Old habits, sir," she said. The Admiral's smile widened because that answer was interesting, and because interesting things in the Admiral's world were usually things he could play with. Old habits. He looked down at the logistics badge on her shirt, the badge that said Hale R. Civilian. He let his eyes linger there for just a moment too long, just visibly enough that the junior officers caught it. "Everybody around here has a call sign." He gestured broadly at the group of SEALs behind him, a magnanimous sweep of the hand. Then he looked directly at Rebecca Hale. "So what was yours?" The corridor went quiet. Not immediately, not all at once. It went quiet the way a room goes quiet when something has been said that the room hasn't yet decided how to categorize. The junior officers still had their smiles in place, the way smiles stay on a face for a half second after the music stops. Commander Mercer's smile had disappeared entirely. He was watching Rebecca with the focused, unreadable attention of a man who had just noticed something he couldn't quite name. Master Chief Owen Briggs had gone completely still. Rebecca did not fidget. She did not look down. She did not produce the embarrassed half laugh that Vance had expected. She held very still for 3 full seconds, which is a surprisingly long time for a corridor moment. And then she looked at the Admiral with eyes that had changed temperature in a way that was difficult to describe but impossible to miss. "I don't use it anymore," she said quietly. "Come on," Vance said, still smiling, still working the room, still believing this was the pleasant interlude of an otherwise administrative morning. "Don't tell me it's classified." He looked sideways at the junior officers, an invitation to share in the gentle joke at the logistics technician's expense. The laughter that followed was softer this time, less certain, because something in Rebecca Hale's stillness was starting to read wrong. She looked at the Admiral. "It was," she said. 2 words, not loud, not aggressive, not a challenge, just a statement. Flat and clean and matter of fact, the way a person says something that has simply always been true, whether or not anyone around them is ready to hear it. The laughter died. Vance kept his smile, but it had changed slightly. It was doing work now. It was the smile of a man who wasn't entirely sure a situation was still going in the direction he'd intended, but who was too committed to the performance to adjust. "Fine," he said easily. "Keep your secrets." He waved a hand toward the continuation of their walk. Rebecca picked up the handle of her equipment cart and turned back down the corridor, and Vance didn't think about it again. But Briggs did. Briggs stood at the back of the group and watched Rebecca Hale push her cart around the far corner, and he felt something cold and specific move through his chest. Not danger, not fear, something more like the physical sensation of a memory trying to push up through a sealed floor. He thought about the way she had moved. He thought about the way she had stood. I thought about the way she had positioned herself in that corridor, her back never fully to the door behind her, her body at the angle that put both exits in her peripheral vision without making it look deliberate, the way her weight sat distributed on her feet in a stance that could convert to movement in any direction without a preparatory shift. He had taught men to stand that way for 30 years. He had never seen someone do it unconsciously. Briggs was quiet for the rest of the walk down the corridor. Mercer noticed but said nothing. The junior officers were already talking about something else. Vance was back in full flow, gesturing at a scheduling board on the wall. Owen Briggs walked with them and said nothing. But in the back of his mind, in a place he hadn't visited in a very long time, a voice he had heard once over a radio 20 years ago in the dark, when 6 men were about to die, said 3 words. Never turn back. He shook his head. That was impossible. He kept walking. 3 hours later, the impossible became harder to dismiss. It started in Training Bay 4. Rebecca Hale was there because logistics had sent her to verify a shipment of equipment that had been delivered to the wrong staging area that morning. She was working through an inventory sheet with the focused disinterest of someone who had a checklist and intended to complete it when Commander Mercer walked in with a group of SEAL candidates for a scheduled weapons familiarization review. Rebecca glanced up, assessed the situation in roughly half a second, and returned to her inventory. The weapons review was standard: a table of components, a discussion of field maintenance, a demonstration of disassembly and reassembly under time constraint. It was one of the candidates, a young man named Torres, 24 years old, 3 months into training, who laid a reassembled rifle on the table and looked up at the instructor with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he had done well. Mercer had turned to check the timing sheet on the wall. From 6 feet away, Rebecca Hale said without looking up from her inventory sheet, "The firing pin retention is seated wrong." Mercer turned. The young candidate looked at his weapon. Mercer crossed to the table and examined the component. He looked up at Rebecca. "How did you see that from there?" he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question, said in the voice of someone recalibrating. Rebecca finally looked up from her sheet. She seemed briefly uncertain whether to answer the way someone seems uncertain when they realize they have done something they didn't mean to do out loud. "The angle on the seating surface," she said simply. "When it's wrong, you can see a gap under the retention lip if the light catches it. It'll cycle 3 or 4 rounds fine and then jam in a bad moment." Mercer was still watching her. "How many times have you seen it jam in a bad moment?" he asked. There was a pause. "Enough," she said, and she went back to her inventory. Mercer looked at Torres. Torres looked at his weapon. Then Mercer carefully re-examined the component, confirmed everything Rebecca had said was correct, and spent the next 10 minutes showing the group exactly what she had described. But for the rest of that session, he kept glancing at the woman with the clipboard in the corner. The second incident happened 30 minutes later in the hallway outside the medical training room. A young medic trainee, 22 years old, first week of advanced casualty care, was reviewing his notes in the hallway when he explained to a colleague somewhat incorrectly the procedure for managing a hemorrhagic torso wound without a tourniquet option. Rebecca was passing. She stopped. She considered the young man for a moment. Then she said quietly enough that it wouldn't embarrass him in front of the crowd, "The sequence is wrong. You have to pack before you apply pressure, or you're pushing blood into the space you're trying to control. And the positioning the way you described it puts the operator behind the casualty's shoulder, which is the wrong angle if the wound track goes through the lateral thorax." The young medic stared. "You've done this," he said. Rebecca looked at him. "I've watched people survive it and people not survive it," she said. "And the ones who didn't usually came down to one step in the wrong order." She continued down the hallway. The young medic pulled out a pen and immediately rewrote his notes. By 400 hours, the story was spreading through the base with the speed that stories spread in small, highly social environments, where everyone's business is theoretically everyone else's business. The logistics woman in Corridor 7, the one the Admiral had teased, the one who could spot a rifle defect from across the room and correct a medic's trauma protocol in passing, and had apparently navigated straight to the correct evacuation route in the afternoon's emergency drill before the instructors had even finished explaining the scenario. Lieutenant Ryan Cole heard about it at 14:15. He was in the officers' mess in that particular afternoon, stillness, when the day has earned a cup of coffee and a brief moment of inhabiting your own accomplishments, and Ensign Park across the table was telling him what had been circulating all morning. Cole listened. His expression went through several phases. Amusement first, then a mild reflexive irritation, then something harder and more personal, which he would not have named if someone had asked him, but which was fundamentally professional vanity. Meeting an inconvenient story. "A logistics tech," he said flatly. "Civilian," Park confirmed. "And people are seriously—" Cole stopped, shook his head, set down his coffee. Look, I've been in this program for 3 years. You don't just know this stuff from reading about it. The kind of instinct they're describing that's trained, deeply trained, over years, thousands of hours of repetition. You don't get that from old habits. He put very pointed quotation marks around those two words with his tone. She's playing the room. She's either exaggerating a partial background or she worked adjacent to the program somewhere and picked up just enough to seem impressive to people who don't know how impressive actually looks. Park looked uncertain. Mercer seemed pretty convinced. Mercer is a thorough man who takes everything seriously, Cole said, which is an excellent quality in an instructor and occasionally works against him in social situations. He stood up, gathered his cup, and dismissed the conversation. But the irritation stayed with him the way irritations do when they're touching something more personal than they appear. At 1600 hours, the entire question became significantly more complicated. Admiral Vance had been hearing the same stories all afternoon. He was not the kind of man who ignored accumulating data, whatever his behavior that morning might have suggested. He found Rebecca Hale in the logistics staging area at the east end of the base, where she was preparing to sign off on the final inventory and hand the area back to the duty officer before going home. "I'd like you to come to Training Bay 1, he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't quite an order because she wasn't military, but it sat in the space between both things in the way that an admiral's requests always sat. Rebecca stopped moving her pen along the clipboard. "Sir," she said carefully, "I have somewhere I need to be this evening. This won't take long." She looked at him. She was weighing something. He could see it in her eyes, a calculation that had nothing to do with inconvenience and everything to do with something else she wasn't saying. "What's this for?" she asked. "I want you to watch something and tell me what you see," he said. "That's all." And something in the specific phrasing of that, "tell me what you see," produced the briefest flicker of an expression on Rebecca Hale's face that Vance couldn't read and wouldn't forget. "All right," she said. 1 hour. Training Bay 1 was the largest assessment space on the base. High ceilings, multiple entry points, a raised observation deck on the north wall. When Rebecca walked in, she found Vance, Mercer, Briggs, Cole, and 4 other senior figures already there, plus a screen showing recorded footage from that morning's advanced tactics training session. Cole turned to look at her when she entered. His expression was not unfriendly, but it was the expression of someone who has decided to be open-minded in a way that cost him nothing because he is confident the situation will quickly confirm what he already believes. "Ms. Hale," Vance said, "I'm going to play a training sequence. I want you to tell me what you observe." Rebecca stood in the center of the room. She had left her clipboard outside. Her hands were at her sides. She watched the screen. Vance started the footage. The sequence showed a 4-man SEAL element moving through a compound simulation. It was recent footage that morning's exercise, and by objective measure, it looked competent. The movement was smooth. The communication was tight. The team covered its corners, managed its spacing, maintained visual contact. The screen played for 90 seconds. Rebecca said nothing. The screen played for 2 more minutes. Rebecca said nothing. Cole's jaw moved slightly, patience in the process of expiring. "Well," Vance said. Rebecca began to speak. She spoke for 8 minutes. She identified 7 distinct tactical errors in the sequence. She did not do this the way an instructor recites from a manual, citing the relevant doctrine, noting the chapter, explaining the rule. She did it the way someone talks about things they have watched go wrong in the physical world, with specific detail and what felt viscerally like memory. She described the way the second man in the stack had compensated for a sightline problem by shifting right, which opened a momentary coverage gap that would have been fatal in a real compound with a hostile in the northeast corridor. She described the communication timing between the lead element and the rear security that had worked in this simulation and would have collapsed under actual noise and stress. She described the particular angle of approach to the second doorway that looked safe on camera and would have silhouetted the entry team against the light source behind them for anyone positioned on the interior stairs. She described what would have happened to the people making each mistake, not theoretically. She described what happens to a human body when a particular mistake is made in a particular context. And she described it with the kind of specific, practical grieving precision of someone who has watched it happen. The room was silent for a long time after she stopped. Commander Mercer slowly turned back to the screen and reviewed 30 seconds of footage. He stopped it, backed it up, watched it again. "She's right," he said quietly. "Everyone." Cole was standing very still. I was a man who was honest with himself when honesty couldn't be avoided. And the honesty that was currently unavoidable was that he had watched that same training footage in the post-exercise debrief that morning and caught 4 of the 7 errors she'd just named. He had been privately satisfied with 4. He had thought 4 was good. He was qualified, experienced, and sharp, and he had caught 4. She had been in the room for 8 minutes and found 7. "Where did you learn this?" Mercer asked. "Experience," Rebecca said. "What unit?" "That's not relevant anymore." The words were not rude. They were not evasive in the way of someone trying to hide something embarrassing. They were the words of someone who had closed a door and was being politely, firmly clear that the door was closed. Cole stepped forward. He had decided that the polite approach was getting everyone the wrong kind of nowhere. "With respect," he said, his voice controlled but carrying a particular edge. "What you're describing, this level of operational understanding, doesn't come from adjacent experience. It doesn't come from reading manuals. It doesn't come from working near people who do this." He paused. "And it doesn't come from old habits." Rebecca looked at him. Cole pressed forward. "So either you had a very specific, very serious operational background that you haven't disclosed, in which case the question of what you're doing in our logistics department is worth asking, or this is a performance. And I'm not in the habit of pretending I can't tell the difference." The room was extremely quiet. Rebecca Hale held Cole's gaze for 4 full seconds. "Okay," she said finally. That was all she said. Just okay. One word in a voice that was the temperature of still water. Vance looked at her. "Okay, what?" "I'll do a controlled assessment," she said, "if that's what this is building toward." Vance hesitated. He had not quite decided if that was what this was building toward, but now that she'd named it, the room's momentum was clearly in that direction. He looked at Mercer. Mercer gave the fractional nod of a man who believes he is about to see something significant. "That can be arranged," Vance said. "One condition," Rebecca said. Everyone waited. "When I'm done, this stops. I have somewhere I need to be." Vance nodded. They moved to the assessment course at 1720 hours. It was not a full SEAL qualification course. Mercer was careful about that. He set up a modified tactical scenario room clearing, target identification, a brief live fire assessment at distance, and a hostage simulation problem that required decision-making under time constraint. The kind of assessment designed to surface the difference between someone who has watched combat and someone who has practiced it until it became reflex. Cole was watching from the observation position. Briggs was watching from beside the timing station. Mercer was running the course. Vance was standing at the back with his arms crossed in the posture of a man who was no longer entirely sure what he was supervising. Rebecca did not warm up. She did not stretch or shake out her hands or do any of the preparatory rituals that indicated someone treating the moment as a performance. She listened to the scenario brief. She asked one question, a quiet, specific question, about the thickness of the simulated compound walls that made Mercer stop and look at her for a moment before answering. Then she stepped to the start position. She was not superhuman on the course. That was the part that Cole would think about later in the quiet of his quarters when he was being most honest with himself. She wasn't faster than the best operators he'd seen. She didn't make it look effortless in the way of someone demonstrating mastery for an audience. She was precise in the way of someone who has exactly the skill they have and does not waste a single motion of it. Every movement in the room clearing was efficient without being showy. The live fire was accurate at a level that told anyone watching it was not the product of occasional range visits. The hostage simulation, when she reached it, she solved in a way that was so unexpectedly lateral, an approach to the scenario that the instructors who built it hadn't considered. That Mercer stood with the timing stopwatch, forgotten in his hand, for nearly 3 full seconds before he remembered to click it. She came off the course and stood quietly. Briggs had not moved from the timing station. He was watching her the way a man watches a ghost. And then everything stopped, because from the adjoining training area came a sound that did not belong in an afternoon assessment. A sharp, bad sound, a human sound, and then another voice, younger, higher, cracking at the edge, calling for help. A SEAL candidate named Dempsey had caught an equipment malfunction during a separate parallel training exercise. It had not been a weapons malfunction, which everyone's emergency training focused on, but a structural failure in the rappelling rig at the wall. And Dempsey had fallen incorrectly, and the way he had landed had done something bad to his left leg and possibly his hip, and he was on the floor of the adjacent bay with two of his training partners beside him who did not know what to do and were making the situation worse by trying to help him move. The response inside the assessment room took approximately 2 seconds to build. In those 2 seconds, everyone began moving in different directions with different priorities, and the information about what had happened was still incomplete, and the training medic for the afternoon shift was apparently on his way from the south end of the base, and 3 people asked questions at the same time. Rebecca was already through the connecting door. She came to one knee beside Dempsey. She looked at his leg, at the angle of his hip, at the position of his hands, which were doing what injured people's hands always do, reaching toward the source of pain in the instinctive and entirely counterproductive way of human beings experiencing their body going wrong. "Move your hands," she said. Her voice was not loud. It was not sharp. It was the particular register of a voice that has, in some previous life, learned exactly how to produce compliance in a moment when compliance is survival. She didn't know the training partner's name. She pointed. "Pressure here. Don't move him. Both hands steady. Don't change the pressure." She looked at the other partner. "Call medical. Tell them suspected hip fracture, possible femoral involvement, candidate is conscious, incoherent." She looked at Dempsey. "You're going to be okay. Don't move your leg. Don't try to help me. Just breathe." Dempsey, who was 21 years old and had been thinking that morning about his Navy career and his girlfriend's upcoming birthday and whether his team would make the playoff standings this season, looked up at this civilian woman in a logistics badge and did exactly what she said. He breathed. Commander Mercer arrived at the door and stopped. Briggs was behind him. In the room, without any authorization from anyone, without any rank or title or credential that this building recognized, Rebecca Hale was managing a casualty response. The training partners had organized themselves around her instructions. Dempsey's position had been stabilized. His hands were away from the injury. His airway was clear. His head was turned at the angle she'd specified. The unnecessary movement that could have converted a fracture into a vascular injury had stopped. Medical arrived 4 minutes later. The lead medic assessed the situation and looked at whoever had managed it before she arrived. Her eyes found Rebecca. "Good call on the femoral watch," the medic said, tying off the monitor cuff. "The angle of entry on this fall, you're right to flag it. Check for compartment pressure in the lower leg too," Rebecca said quietly. "The way he landed, it's possible." The medic looked at her for a moment, then nodded and did. Rebecca stood. She walked to the small utility sink on the wall. She turned on the water. She washed blood from her hands. And Admiral Thomas Vance stood in the doorway of the adjoining bay and watched her and said nothing for a very long time. When the medical team had wheeled Dempsey out and the training partners had been sent to debrief and the noise of the emergency had drained from the room, and it was just the senior personnel standing in the afternoon quiet, Vance walked toward Rebecca. She was drying her hands. She wasn't looking at him. He stopped 2 feet away and waited until she looked up. "Who are you?" he said. "Rebecca Hale." "That isn't what I asked." She looked at him, the same look she had given him in the corridor that morning. But something in it had shifted, not the temperature that was still steady and still, but the depth of it, as if the question had finally reached the part of the look that had always been there. "Sir," she said quietly, "some doors are closed for a reason." Vance stared at her. Behind him, Owen Briggs was standing with his arms at his sides and the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just for the first time in 20 years felt the shape of where it came from. Vance looked back at Rebecca. "I'm going to need those doors opened," he said. Rebecca looked past him for a moment toward the window that faced west, where the California sun was sliding toward the water. "I know," she said softly. She set the towel down on the sink edge, and she did not look like a woman who was afraid of what came next. She looked like a woman who had known, since the moment an Admiral laughed at her in a corridor that morning, that this was always where the day was going. She had simply been deciding whether the people in this room had earned it yet. And somewhere in the medical wing, a 21-year-old candidate named Dempsey was lying still and breathing steadily, his legs stable, his body held together by decisions made in 4 minutes by a woman whose badge said logistics and whose hands remembered things that 4 minutes of quiet efficiency could barely scratch the surface of. Briggs looked at the door through which Rebecca had walked. He looked at the door for a long time, and then he said to no one in particular, in a voice that was not quite steady, Red Valley. Nobody in the room knew what he meant, but the way he said it told them that whatever it was, it had weight enough to bend a man like Owen Briggs. And that nothing, not the afternoon's assessment, not the casualty response, not the corridor that morning, not the Admiral's joke, none of it had been what it appeared to be. Not even close. The medical team had been gone for 11 minutes when Admiral Vance ordered everyone back into Training Bay 1. Not as a suggestion, as a directive. The kind that arrives without explanation and expects compliance before the echo dies. Mercer gathered the senior personnel. Briggs followed without a word. Cole came last, his jaw set in the particular way of a man who is processing something he hasn't finished processing yet, but refuses to let that show on his face. Rebecca came back in from the hallway where she had been standing alone, looking at nothing or perhaps looking at something only she could see. She had her logistics clipboard back in her hand. The small normalcy of it, that clipboard, that badge, that plain civilian shirt, sat strangely against everything the last 40 minutes had established. Vance stood at the center of the room and looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. "I owe you an apology," he said. The room registered surprise. Admirals did not typically open with that. "For this morning," he continued, "the corridor, what I said." He paused. That was out of line. Rebecca looked at him steadily. "You didn't know," she said. "That's exactly what I'm going to address," Vance said. But first, he stopped, started again. "I need to understand what I'm looking at." Rebecca said nothing. "The rifle component," Mercer said from the side of the room, because someone had to start threading this together. The medic in the hallway, the evacuation route in the drill this afternoon, the tactical assessment, what happened in there with Dempsey. He spread his hands slightly. "Ms. Hale, those are not civilian skill sets." "Some of them are," Rebecca said quietly. "Anyone who's done enough emergency response work knows trauma sequencing." "Not the way you knew it," the medic who had arrived on scene said from the doorway. She had stayed. Nobody had told her to, and nobody had told her to leave, and she had the expression of someone who understood that she had witnessed something worth staying for. "I've been doing trauma response for 9 years. The call you made on the femoral watch, the compartment pressure catch, that's not emergency response training. That's operational experience. That's seeing what happens when you get it wrong in a context where getting it wrong means somebody doesn't come home." The room was quiet. Rebecca looked at the medic. Something moved through her face that wasn't quite a reaction and wasn't quite suppression. It was the look of someone being seen accurately by someone unexpected and not being entirely sure how to stand inside that moment. "I've had some relevant experience," she said carefully. Cole made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite disbelief, something compressed between both. "Relevant experience," and he said. "You identified 7 tactical errors in a recorded exercise, 2 of which our own debrief team missed this morning. You managed a casualty response that the duty medic said was textbook executed. You solved a hostage scenario that the instructors who built it hadn't considered. And you did all of it while pretending to be here to check inventory." "I was here to check inventory," Rebecca said. "Ms. Hale." Vance's voice was quieter now. The performance register had dropped out of it entirely. What was left was just a man asking a direct question. "What is your background?" Rebecca set the clipboard down on the nearest table. She looked at the floor for a moment, not in defeat in the way of someone choosing their words the way a careful person chooses their footing on uncertain ground. "I served," she said, "a long time ago in a program that doesn't have a public name. The work I did is classified at a level I can't discuss without authorization I don't currently have." She looked up. "And I'm not going to discuss it anyway, because that's not why I'm here." "Then why are you here?" Cole asked. "Because this is where the job was," she said simply. Cole stared at her. "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I'm going to give you right now," she said. Not unkindly, but with a finality that had the texture of something load-bearing. Vance looked at Mercer. Mercer looked at Briggs. Briggs was looking at Rebecca with an expression that the others couldn't fully read because it wasn't quite the expression of a man hearing something new. It was the expression of a man hearing something confirmed. "I'm going to have your credentials verified," Vance said. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact delivered in the voice of a man who had just decided something. Rebecca looked at him. All right, she said. And again, like that morning, like the assessment, like every moment in this long, strange day, she did not look afraid of what that meant. She looked like someone who already knew exactly what that conversation was going to produce and had already made her peace with it arriving. She picked up her clipboard. I need to finish my inventory before the transport window closes, she said. If there's nothing else. Vance nodded once. She walked out. And the moment the door closed, Cole turned to the room and said what everyone had been thinking. Who the hell is she? Nobody answered. Because nobody knew, but Briggs Owen Briggs, who had spent 30 years learning to trust the thing in his gut that other people called instinct and he called survival. Briggs looked at the closed door and said very quietly to no one in particular, I think I might. Nobody heard him, or if they did, they didn't know yet what to do with it. The credentials request went through normal channels at waiting 03 hours. Standard background verification. The kind that runs on every civilian contractor, every logistics technician, every base employee without a military ID. It was supposed to take 48 hours. It was supposed to produce a service record, an employment history, a security clearance level, and a photograph that matched the face on the badge. At 0804 hours, 60 seconds after the request was submitted, the system returned a response that the duty officer in the security office had never seen before. Not a delay notice, not a pending flag, not the standard holding message that appeared when records were in the process of being retrieved. The screen showed 3 lines: access restricted, record sealed, flag officer authorization required, contact Naval Special Warfare Command priority channel. The duty officer stared at the screen for a moment. Then he picked up the phone and called his supervisor. His supervisor stared at the screen for a moment. Then he called Commander Mercer. Mercer stared at the screen for a moment. Then he called Admiral Vance. It was 1821 hours when Vance arrived at the security office and looked at the screen himself. He stood with his hands behind his back and read the 3 lines twice. His expression didn't change in any dramatic way. But something behind his eyes tightened in the manner of a man who has just realized that the perimeter of a situation is considerably larger than he had estimated. Get me the priority channel, he said. Sir, the duty officer said carefully. The priority channel for Naval Special Warfare Command at this hour is going to go to... I know where it goes, Vance said. Get it. The call took 9 minutes to connect. When it did, the voice on the other end asked Vance 2 questions before he had finished his first sentence, and then told him to stand by. The hold lasted 4 minutes. When the voice came back, it said 5 words. Do not proceed without authorization. Vance said, whose authorization? The voice said, it's being arranged. The call ended. Vance put the phone down and stood in the security office with that particular stillness of a man who has just understood that the ground beneath his situation goes much deeper than he was prepared to excavate tonight. He looked at the 3 lines on the screen again. Record sealed, flag officer authorization required. He had seen sealed records before. Everyone in his position had. They existed for operators whose classified service made their personnel files sensitive national security documents. They existed for people who had done things in places that the official record of American military activity did not acknowledge. They existed for people whose names in certain classified archives carried designations that were known to a very small number of very senior people and nobody else. He hadn't expected to find one attached to the logistics technician he'd made laugh at in the corridor that morning. He went home. He did not sleep well. At 06:12 the following morning, Vance was in his office when the call came through from the Naval Special Warfare Priority Line. Vice Admiral Grant will be at Coronado at 1100, the voice said. Please ensure a secure conference room is available and that access to the base personnel system is ready for his use. Vance said, William Grant is coming here personally. The voice said, yes, sir, for a credentials verification on a civilian logistics employee. There was a pause on the line that lasted exactly long enough to confirm that the person on the other end understood the implicit question and had been told not to answer it. Vice Admiral Grant will be there at 1100, sir. The call ended. Vance sat in his office for a moment. Then he called Mercer. Get Briggs, he said, and Cole, my conference room. 45 minutes. There was a pause. And Mrs. Hale, Vance thought about that. No, he said, not yet. He hung up. What he did not know, what none of them knew, was that at 06:34 that morning, Rebecca Hale was already on base. She had arrived at 0610 for a scheduled early morning logistics run, completed the first half of her inventory, and was currently in the break room adjacent to the loading dock, eating a sandwich she had packed at home because the cafeteria didn't open until 7, and reading a worn paperback novel that she'd been working through for 3 weeks because she never had enough uninterrupted time to get through more than 20 pages at a sitting. She did not know about the sealed record response. She did not know about the priority channel call. She did not know that Vice Admiral William Grant, a man who knew her name, her service record, and the full classified weight of what both of those things meant, was currently in a vehicle somewhere between San Diego and Coronado, carrying a sealed folder that had last been opened 7 years ago. She turned a page of her novel. Outside the break room window, the base was waking up. Inside Vance's conference room at 0700, the 4 men sat around a table and tried to organize what they knew. It didn't take long because what they knew was almost nothing, and what they suspected was enormous. And the gap between those two things was sitting in the room with them like a fifth person. Mercer went first. He laid out the sequence of the previous afternoon methodically: the rifle component, the medic correction, the drill route, the tactical assessment, the hostage scenario, the casualty response. He described each incident with the precision of a man who had been cataloging them since they happened, building a file in his head that he hadn't known he was building. "What does it add up to?" Vance asked. "Elite operational background," Mercer said. "Not adjacent, not secondhand, primary. Whoever trained her or whoever she trained alongside was working at the highest level." He paused. "And she's been out long enough that her instincts have settled into something automatic. She doesn't think about it anymore. It's just what she does." "The way she positioned herself in the corridor," Briggs said. Everyone looked at him. He hadn't spoken since he'd sat down. "Yesterday morning," Briggs said, "when the Admiral first spoke to her, did anyone else notice how she was standing?" Mercer nodded slowly. "Back to the wall, both exits in peripheral vision. She never turned her back on the unsecured door behind her," Briggs said. "The whole time. She adjusted twice naturally, like she was shifting her weight. But she never gave up the sight line." Cole frowned. "That's basic." "That's not basic," Briggs said flatly. "That's years. That's thousands of hours of operating in environments where giving up that sight line is what gets you killed. You do it long enough, it stops being a choice. It becomes what your body does." He looked at the table. "I've seen operators retire after 15 years and still can't eat in a restaurant without sitting with their back to the wall. It doesn't go away." The room was quiet. "There's something else," Briggs said. His voice had changed slightly, not louder. Quieter in the way that important things sometimes require less volume, not more. 22 years ago, he said, "I was part of a 6-man reconnaissance element operating in a classified theater. I'm not going to give you coordinates or a country because I still can't. What I can tell you is that an intelligence failure put us on the wrong side of a cordon with no extraction route, no air support, in a timeline that was closing down." He stopped. "We were on the radio for 4 hours. Our command couldn't reach us. Our rescue channel was compromised. And then at 0230, a voice came over a frequency that we'd been told was a dead channel. Nobody moved. Female voice," Briggs said, very calm, "gave us a route out that our own maps didn't show, walked us through 3 checkpoints that she had apparently already cleared one at a time in the dark alone. All 6 of us made it to the extraction point." He paused again. "We never saw who it was. Command gave us nothing. When I filed my debrief and asked who the operator on that channel was, the section chief looked at me and said the information wasn't available at my clearance level." He looked up. "But before the channel went dark, she said one thing, one instruction at the start of the whole sequence." Cole leaned forward almost involuntarily. Briggs said, "Never turn your back on an unsecured door." The conference room was absolutely silent. Mercer was staring at Briggs. Cole had stopped breathing in the way people stop breathing when their mind is catching up to their body's understanding of a moment. Vance was very still. "You think she was that operator?" Mercer said. "Not a question, a calibration." "I think," Briggs said carefully, "that when that woman stood in the corridor yesterday and the Admiral asked for her call sign, she went somewhere. Somewhere inside herself. The way people go somewhere when they're asked to name a thing they have buried." He looked at Vance directly. "And I think the reason she said it was classified wasn't because she was embarrassed. It was because it actually was. Vance sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "What was the designation in your debrief?" "The unidentified operator." Briggs looked at him. "That's the part I can't tell you," Briggs said, "because I don't have the clearance to say that name in an unsecured room." Cole's head came up sharply. "You know the call sign." "I know the designation that appeared in the classified addendum to our after-action report," Briggs said. "I saw it once for about 30 seconds before the section chief took the document back and told me to forget I'd read it." He paused. "I didn't forget." "Then say it," Cole said. "No," Briggs said simply. "Not here, not without knowing what we're walking into." Vance looked at his watch. 1100 was still 4 hours away. 4 hours in which every person in this room was going to sit with the shape of a thing they couldn't name yet, circling it the way you circle something in the dark that you can see the outline of but can't quite bring into focus. 80912. Rebecca finished her morning inventory run, filed the completed sheets with the duty logistics officer, and went to her car to retrieve her brother's medication schedule, which she had forgotten on the passenger seat. She stood beside the car in the morning air for a moment, looking at the handwritten chart medication. Names, dosages, times the physical therapy appointment at 2:00, the follow-up call with the neurologist at 4:30, and she folded it carefully and put it in her shirt pocket. Then she went back inside. She passed the conference room on her way to the east loading dock. The door was closed. She did not slow down. 80947. Cole left the conference room to get coffee and found himself walking the same corridor where everything had started yesterday morning. He stood there for a moment with his cup and looked at the length of it, the plain institutional walls, the overhead lights, the equipment, bays off to the sides, and tried to imagine what it looked like to someone who had done what Briggs was describing. Someone who had walked into hostile situations alone. Someone whose entire professional identity had been built around going unnoticed. What did a place like this look like to someone like that? He turned that question over in his mind. And then he thought about something that had been bothering him since the assessment the previous afternoon. Something he hadn't been able to articulate until this moment, standing in the corridor alone. She had slowed down. He had seen it. He had thought in the moment that he was imagining it, that he was looking for a reason to discount what he was watching. But he hadn't been imagining it. Twice during the room-clearing sequence, she had fractionally reduced her speed in a way that was invisible unless you were specifically watching for the difference between someone performing at their limit and someone performing inside it. And once during the live fire assessment, she had paused barely, maybe half a second, in a way that looked like natural rhythm, but which Cole, who had spent 3 years studying the difference between natural and managed rhythm and operators under assessment, recognized as a deliberate choice. She had not shown them everything. She had shown them enough to end the conversation, and she had kept the rest. The coffee in his cup had gone slightly cold by the time he walked back to the conference room and opened the door and said to the 3 men inside, "She was holding back yesterday." Mercer looked up. "During the assessment," Cole said, "she controlled what we saw." Briggs looked at him. "Yes," Briggs said, "she did." "You noticed too." "I noticed," Briggs said. I didn't say anything because I was still working through what I was seeing." "So what she showed us," Cole said, pulling out his chair and sitting down, "was a managed version, a version calibrated to be enough, but not more than enough." "She didn't want to be identified," Mercer said slowly. "She wanted to end the pressure, not create a bigger situation." "That's operational thinking," Cole said. "That's not someone showing off. That's someone managing exposure." He looked at the table. "That's someone who has spent a significant portion of their professional life making very careful decisions about what other people are allowed to see." The room absorbed that. Vance said, "Which means whatever she was holding back is considerably more than what we saw," Mercer finished. At 10:48, 12 minutes before Vice Admiral Grant was scheduled to arrive, Rebecca Hale was informed by the duty officer that her presence was requested in the main conference room. The duty officer was professional and neutral and gave her no additional information. Rebecca looked at him for a moment. "Is this Admiral Vance?" she asked. "I'm not able to say more than what I've told you, ma'am." She considered that for about 3 seconds. "All right," she said. She set down the equipment she was carrying. She straightened her badge. She did not check her appearance in any reflective surface, did not adjust her hair, did not do any of the preparatory things that people do when they are nervous about being seen. She simply turned and walked toward the conference room with the same unhurried sightline, aware quietly lethal economy of movement that had started this entire chain of events 23 hours ago in a corridor not 50 feet from where she was standing now. She arrived at the conference room door at 10:53. She knocked once. Vance said, "Come in." She opened the door and stepped inside. She saw Vance Mercer Cole. She saw Briggs, who looked at her with an expression that she could not immediately categorize and that sensed something quiet and careful moving through her chest. And then she registered the fifth person in the room, the man standing at the far end of the table with his cap under his arm and a sealed folder on the table in front of him, and everything in Rebecca Hale's face and body became very, very still. Vice Admiral William Grant was 61 years old. He had the build of a man who had once been physically exceptional and had let time compress that into something solid and enduring. He had gray eyes that were currently looking at Rebecca with an expression that was not surprise. He had known she was here, had known for 12 hours, had driven from San Diego this morning because of it, but that was something more complex than surprise. It was the expression of a man confronting in the physical world, something that has lived in classified documents for a long time. It was recognition, and beneath the recognition, something that looked to Rebecca's carefully trained eye like respect. "Rebecca," he said, just her name. No title, no rank, because she no longer held one. Just her name said in the voice of a man for whom that name carried a specific and considerable weight. "Admiral Grant," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were at her sides. She did not look at the sealed folder on the table. Vance looked between the two of them. "You know each other." "We've met," Grant said simply. He looked at Vance. "Tom, I need the room except for you and Master Chief Briggs." Mercer and Cole exchanged a glance. Cole looked like a man being asked to leave his own house. "Sir," he started. "Commander Mercer, Lieutenant Cole," Grant said without raising his voice, without shifting his weight, without doing anything except saying their names and ranks in the tone of a man who has not had to repeat a request in 20 years and does not intend to start today. "Thank you." They left. The door closed. 4 people remained: Vance, Grant, Briggs, and Rebecca. Grant looked at the sealed folder on the table. He looked at Rebecca. "Do you want to do this, or would you prefer I do?" he asked. "I'd prefer neither," Rebecca said quietly. "I know," Grant said. "But Tom ran a credentials check last night, and when a sealed record kicks back a flag officer authorization request to NAV Specwar Priority Channel, the situation has already moved past preference." Rebecca looked at Vance. Vance met her eyes. She read something in his face that she hadn't expected to find there. Not the casual authority of the man in the corridor, not the entertained confidence of someone who has never questioned the ground beneath his rank. Something less comfortable. Something that might, if she was reading it correctly, be the early stages of genuine accountability. "All right," she said. Grant put his hand on the sealed folder. And Briggs, who had been silent since she walked in, who had been watching her with that expression she still hadn't categorized, said it from the corner of the room. "Before you open that," everyone looked at him. Briggs looked at Rebecca directly. "Red Valley," he said. The name hit the room differently than words usually hit rooms. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was 2 words in a quiet voice, but they arrived with the physical weight of something that had been carried a long time. Rebecca looked at Briggs. For the first time since she had walked into this room, something in her face moved in a way that wasn't controlled. It was brief. It was small. It was the involuntary, unmistakable flicker of someone hearing a name they have not heard spoken out loud in a very long time, in a context they had not expected by a person they had not recognized until this exact moment. Her lips parted slightly. She said nothing. Briggs said, 6 men, north of the ridge, 0230, a dead channel that came alive. Rebecca was very still. "That was 22 years ago," she said finally. Her voice was quieter than it had been. Not weak, just quieter. "Yes," Briggs said. "You were there." "Second position in the stack," Briggs said. "I was 29 years old and I was going to die, and then a woman I never saw told me where to walk, and I came home to my wife and my kids." His voice was the voice of a man who has been honest with himself about this for a long time alone in the private accounting he does at the end of long nights. "I filed a debrief asking for the identity of the operator, and they told me it was above my clearance." "It was," Rebecca said. "What was your call sign?" Briggs asked. The room was absolutely still. Grant had his hand on the sealed folder and had not opened it. Vance was not breathing. Rebecca looked at Briggs for a long moment. Then she said it. She said it the way someone says a name they haven't used in years. Not with pride, not with drama, with the quiet factual simplicity of something that is simply true, whether the world acknowledges it or not. 2 words. And every sealed document, every classified archive, every flag officer restricted record in the Naval Special Warfare System suddenly had a face. Grant opened the folder, and Admiral Thomas Vance, who had stood in a corridor 23 hours ago and pointed at this woman and laughed, felt the floor of his professional self-understanding shift in a way that it had never shifted before. Not because of what was in the folder, because of what Briggs did next. Briggs Master Chief Owen Briggs, 52 years old, 30 years of service, a man who had not flinched at things that had broken other men, permanently stood up from his chair. He came to attention, full attention, the kind that lives in the body and means something. His shoulders squared, his chin came level, his hands went to his sides. He looked at Rebecca, and the toughest man in the room had something in his eyes that he was not going to apologize for. "You brought us home," he said. Rebecca looked at him. "That was the mission," she said softly, and in the sealed folder on the table under a designation that only a handful of people in the American military had ever been authorized to read, was the record of a woman who had never needed anyone in this room to know her name. She had just needed them to come home alive. The folder had 43 pages. Grant didn't open it all the way. He opened it to the first section, turned it on the table so that Vance could read the header, and then he stepped back and let the words do what words like that do when they land in front of someone who wasn't prepared for them. Vance read the header. He read it once. Then he read it again more slowly, the way a person rereads something when their mind is insisting. The first pass was a misread. His face did not collapse. It did not produce the dramatic, visible crumbling of a man publicly humiliated. It did something quieter and in many ways worse. It went through a sequence of small, private adjustments. The jaw, the eyes, the set of the mouth. That was the facial equivalent of a man quietly reorganizing the interior of something that had just been rearranged without his permission. He looked up at Rebecca. She was watching him, not with satisfaction, not with anything that resembled the pleasure of a reversal. She was watching him the way someone watches a process they understand and cannot stop and have long since made their peace with. "How long?" Vance said. "How long were you active?" 11 years, Rebecca said. Grant said 11 years, 4 months, and some days she's probably not counting anymore. Rebecca looked at Grant sideways. He almost smiled. Vance looked back at the folder. "The designations in here, these operations?" He stopped, looked at a specific page. "This one, 2009, the Brenner extraction." He looked up. "I know that operation. I know the official record of that operation. There is no mention of a ground support element in the classified version." "No," Grant said, "there isn't. Because the ground support element didn't exist on paper," Grant said. "That was the point." Vance set the page down. He looked at Rebecca with the expression of a man recalibrating something very large. "You were the reason that crew came home." "There were a lot of reasons that crew came home," Rebecca said. "You were one of them." She said nothing. "How many?" Vance asked. Grant answered before Rebecca could. The operations attributed to her designation direct and support role involved the recovery of 41 American personnel over 11 years, across 6 theaters. Some of those recoveries are still classified at levels that aren't available in this room. He paused. The ones that are available, they're in the folder. Vance didn't reach for the folder again. He looked at Rebecca and said, "Why are you moving equipment cases in my logistics department?" The question landed differently than the questions that had come before it. The earlier questions had been investigative. Who are you? What is your background? What are you hiding? This question was something else. It was personal. It was the question of a man who had just been shown an enormous distance between what he assumed and what was real, and was trying to understand how that distance had been allowed to exist. Rebecca looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "My brother." Vance waited. "His name is Daniel," she said. "He's 31. He was in Army logistics. Training accident 4 years ago. Traumatic brain injury, partial mobility loss on the left side, chronic pain management issues." She said it the way someone says something they have said many times to many doctors and insurance adjusters and administrative officers, factually without sentimentality. Because sentimentality is a luxury you trade away when you become someone's primary caregiver. My mother passed before his accident. My father has been gone since we were kids. It's just me. She paused. The position here was close to his rehab facility. The hours were flexible enough that I could manage his appointment schedule. The security clearance requirement meant I could work on a base without spending 6 months in the paperwork system explaining my background. A beat. It worked. The room was quiet. Briggs, who was still standing, lowered himself slowly back into his chair. He did it the way a man sits down when the weight of something has just redistributed itself across his understanding of the world. You left the program, Grant said quietly, because of Daniel. I requested separation, Rebecca said. They didn't ask me to leave. I know, Grant said. I was the one who approved it. Something moved through Rebecca's face at that, brief, complex. You never told me that, she said. No, Grant said. I didn't. He looked at the folder. There are things in here that I should have said differently. Things that should have been handled differently when you separated. He looked up at her. That's a conversation for another time, but I want you to know I'm aware of it. Rebecca looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once and let it go with the efficiency of someone who has learned that holding on to what can't be changed is weight you can't afford. Vance had been listening to this exchange with the focused attention of a man assembling something in real time. He looked between Grant and Rebecca, and then he said, "What does Daniel know about your background?" "He knows I served," Rebecca said. "He knows it was classified. He doesn't ask details." A pause. "He's a veteran. He understands that there are things you don't push." "Does he know what you're doing here? What you're actually qualified to be doing?" Rebecca looked at Vance steadily. "He knows I work at the base. He knows the schedule works for us." She paused. "He doesn't know about yesterday." What would he say if he did? For the first time in this very long conversation, something that was almost not quite but almost a smile crossed Rebecca Hale's face. It didn't last more than a second. "He'd tell me I should have let the case fall and not drawn the attention." Vance stared at her. Then, against everything the morning had prepared him for, he laughed. A real laugh. Short and sharp and involuntary, the laugh of a man surprised out of his own gravity by something unexpectedly human. He caught it quickly, but it had been real. "Smart kid," he said. "He has his moments," Rebecca said. The moment passed, the room resettled into its serious register. Grant reached into the folder and removed 3 pages, which he set on the table separately from the rest. He looked at Vance. "Tom, what I'm about to show you, and what Briggs already knows, this doesn't leave this room without my direct authorization. I need that understood." Vance straightened. "Understood." Grant looked at Rebecca. "I'd like your permission," he said. Not permission to open the documents. He already had that authority. He was asking her something different, whether she wanted to be present for this, whether she consented to being known in this room in this way by these men. Rebecca looked at the 3 pages on the table. She looked at Briggs, who was watching her with an expression that had not changed since he'd stood at attention. That expression was going to be with her for a while. She looked at Vance, who had the look of a man who had been wrong in a significant way and knew it and was not flinching from it, which she respected more than she would have expected to. She said, "Go ahead." Grant placed his hand on the first page. "Night Fox," he said. And those 2 words, the call sign she hadn't heard spoken in this context, in this register in years, settled into the room with a weight that was almost physical. Vance went very still, because he knew that designation. Not from her, not from anything that had happened in the last 24 hours. He knew it from a briefing 4 years earlier, given to a select group of senior naval special warfare commanders by a JSOC intelligence officer, who had used it as a case study in what successful unacknowledged operational support could look like when it was done at the highest level. The designation had appeared 3 times in that briefing, each time attached to an outcome that the intelligence officer had described without any evident irony as remarkable. Vance had filed it away as a piece of interesting institutional history. He had not expected to be sitting across a conference table from it. "You know it," Grant said, watching Vance's face. "The JSOC briefing," Vance said. 4 years ago, Harris ran it. He used 3 cases. He looked at Rebecca. 2 of the 3 cases were... "Yes," Grant said simply. Vance looked at the folder. He looked at Rebecca. He said, "I made a joke." It wasn't an apology yet. It was something that came before an apology, the moment of full comprehension. When the specific weight of what you did settles completely into your understanding and you feel it for the first time without any of the cushioning of not quite knowing. Rebecca looked at him. You didn't know, she said. No, Vance said. I didn't. But that's the problem, isn't it? She held his gaze and said nothing because he had arrived at the right place on his own, and saying nothing was the most honest response available. Grant continued. He walked through the operational record with the calm efficiency of a man who has carried classified information long enough that he knows how to deliver it without drama, because the information itself is dramatic enough. He described the program Rebecca had served in its structure, its mandate, its deliberate invisibility. He described the nature of her specialization surveillance infiltration, the particular and extraordinarily rare skill of recovering personnel from situations that conventional rescue could not reach because conventional rescue could be seen. Night Fox could not be seen. That was not a metaphor. That was the operational reality. 11 years of assignments in which her presence was the primary asset, because if she was noticed, the mission was over before it started, and the people she was trying to bring home stayed where they were. Briggs listened to all of it. Dean had known fragments. He had known the fragment that belonged to him. Red Valley 2002, 6 men and a dead channel and a voice that walked them home. But fragments are not the whole thing, and the whole thing laid out across 43 pages in the calm voice of a vice admiral on a Tuesday morning in a secure conference room in Coronado was something that made the fragments feel small. When Grant finished, the room was quiet for a long time. Then Vance stood up. He pushed his chair back and he stood up and he walked around the table to where Rebecca was sitting, and he stood in front of her and he said, "Stand up." Rebecca looked at him. It was not an order. He wasn't ordering her. He was asking in the particular register of a man who has earned the right to ask something once and wait. She stood. Vance looked at her. The decorated admiral, the 30 years, the gold braid, all of it present in the room, and somehow at this moment not the most significant thing he was wearing. "I owe you an apology that is larger than what happened yesterday," he said, "and I'm going to give you the full version of it, publicly, with my name on it." He paused. "But right now here I want to say I'm sorry, not for not knowing, for making the not knowing into a performance." Rebecca looked at him for a long moment. "Apology accepted," she said. "It was not warm. It was not cold. It was honest, the response of someone who means what they say and doesn't decorate it." Vance nodded once. He looked at Grant. "I want to understand something," he said. "Why is she here? Why is someone with this record working in our logistics department and not—" He stopped himself, recalibrated. "What I mean is, did the institution know? Does NAVSpecWar know that Night Fox is moving equipment cases at Coronado?" Grant looked at Rebecca. Rebecca looked back at him. A decision passed between them that had the texture of something that had been considered before in private more than once. The institution knows that Rebecca Hale is a former classified operator who separated under honorable circumstances and requested a civilian position close to her family, Grant said carefully. The specific weight of what that means is known to a very small number of people. "Who?" Vance asked. "Myself," Grant said, "2 others at the chalk level, and until yesterday, nobody at Coronado." Vance absorbed that. "She requested it that way?" he asked. "She requested it that way," Grant confirmed. Vance looked at Rebecca. Why, Rebecca said, "Because I wasn't here to be Night Fox. I was here to take care of my brother." The directness of it stopped the room. "That's all," Vance said. "That's everything," Rebecca said. "When you've done what I did for as long as I did it, when you come out the other side, the mission changes." The mission became Daniel, making sure he gets his medication on time, making sure he makes his PT appointments, making sure when he has a hard night, somebody is there. She paused. "That's not a lesser mission. That's just a different one." Cole was not in the room. But what was being said in the room was going to reach him. Not today, not officially, not through any channel that Grant would have sanctioned. But in small institutions with long memories, in short corridors, truth moves the way water moves, finding the available path, arriving, eventually whether or not it was invited. At 12:23, Grant called a brief recess. Rebecca used it to call Daniel's care coordinator and confirm the 2 PT appointment was still scheduled. She stood in the hallway outside the conference room with her phone to her ear, her voice quiet and specific about his medication timing, and when she came back inside, she was once again simply Rebecca Hale with the logistics badge and the worn-in boots, except that now 3 men in that room knew that the simplicity was a choice, not a condition. At 1241, Mercer knocked on the conference room door. Grant opened it. Mercer looked at Grant, then at Vance, then at Rebecca. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, and his voice carried the particular urgency of someone who has been waiting outside a closed door with information that cannot wait for the door to open on its own. "But I need someone to see something." He had a tablet in his hand. He turned it toward Grant. Grant looked at the screen for 3 seconds. His expression changed. "Where did this come from?" he said. 15 minutes ago, Mercer said. "It came through the base intel channel, routine distribution. But the terrain markers," he stopped. "Sir, I think you need to look at this with Rebecca." Grant looked at Rebecca. "Come in," Grant said to Mercer. Mercer came in. He sat the tablet on the table. On the screen was a topographic overlay, classified, watermarked, timestamped from 40 minutes ago, showing a region that none of them could name in an unsecured channel, but that 2 of the people in this room recognized immediately. Rebecca recognized it. She leaned forward. She said nothing for 11 seconds, which was a very long time to say nothing, while 3 senior military officers watched her face. Then she said, "How many on?" "The initial report says 6, Mercer said. "Possibly more." "The extraction timeline is, who's the element?" she asked. "Reconnaissance. They were 6 hours into a 48-hour surveillance mission when the insertion route got compromised. They've got a cordon closing from the northeast, and their primary extraction window closes, so no." He checked the tablet. "In 19 hours. Rebecca straightened. She looked at the terrain overlay again. She looked at something on the left edge of it that nobody else in the room was looking at. "That ridge," she said. Mercer followed her eyes. "What about it?" "The gradient on the southwest face," she said. "What's the current satellite resolution on that section?" Mercer looked at her. "I can get it," he said. "Get it," she said. And something shifted in the room in that moment. Subtle, tectonic, the kind of shift that doesn't make noise, but changes the load-bearing structure of everything around it. Because the woman who had spent the last 24 hours being questioned and assessed and apologized to had just, without any decision being visibly made, moved into a different register entirely. She wasn't Rebecca Hale, the logistics technician, asking careful questions. She was looking at a trapped reconnaissance team on a topographic overlay, and her mind was already somewhere on that southwest ridge, doing something that nobody else in the room had gotten to yet. Vance recognized it because he had seen it in operators. He had seen it in the very best ones, that quality of attention that stops looking at the problem from the outside and goes inside it the way you go inside a room instead of looking at the door. He looked at Grant. Grant was watching Rebecca. His expression was the expression of a man who was not surprised by what he was seeing, because he had seen it before. 11 years of it. At 13:09, the satellite imagery arrived. Rebecca looked at it for 4 minutes without speaking. She asked for the last 48 hours of weather data for the region. She asked for the element's current position coordinates, which Mercer provided after a 2-minute authorization process. She asked for the cordon movement rate, which required a third call to a channel that Mercer didn't have direct access to and had to route through Grant. While they were getting it, she stood at the table with her hands flat on the surface and looked at the overlay and did something with her eyes that Briggs recognized, and Vance was starting to recognize, and Cole, who had been quietly let back into the room at 12:55, because Grant had decided that what was happening was something Cole needed to see, watched with the specific expression of a man revising himself. At 13:18, she said, "There's a route." Everyone looked at her. She pointed to a section of the overlay that the extraction planning team, she had been told there was an extraction planning team working the problem from a command location 4 time zones away, had dismissed as non-viable 12 hours ago because the approach required moving through a terrain feature that the topographic data showed as impassable. "The data's wrong," she said. Mercer said, "That's the current satellite." "The satellite is reading the surface," she said. "But this area, this specific section, had a major erosion event, I'm estimating 8 to 12 years ago, based on the vegetation pattern on the edges of this image. The erosion would have created a secondary drainage channel on the southwest face that the topographic model hasn't been updated to reflect." She looked at Mercer. "Is there any ground-level imaging from this region in the last decade?" Mercer was already on his phone. Grant was watching Rebecca with his arms crossed. Vance was leaning over the table studying the overlay where she had pointed. How do you know about an erosion event from a satellite image? Cole asked. He wasn't challenging her. He was asking the question of someone who genuinely wants to understand the reasoning, which was a different kind of question from everything he had asked her yesterday. Rebecca looked at him. I've operated in terrain adjacent to this region, she said simply. The geology follows a pattern across this range. When you've moved through it on foot in multiple conditions, the imagery starts to tell you things that the models don't capture. She paused. You learn to read what you're looking at instead of reading what the model says it should look like. Cole absorbed that. You've been in there, he said. Adjacent, she said again. At 1341, the ground level imaging came back. There was one photograph, a reconnaissance image from 7 years ago taken by a different element for a different mission that covered the southwest face of the ridge, in question from an angle that the current satellite coverage did not. It showed a drainage channel, exactly where Rebecca had said it would be. Mercer looked up from the image. She's right, he said. The room was quiet for a beat. Then it was not quiet because Grant had his phone out and Vance was speaking rapidly to someone in the base operations center, and Mercer was pulling up the element's current communications window, and the 19-hour clock that had been sitting at the edge of everyone's awareness became suddenly concretely real. Rebecca stepped back from the table. She had given them what she had. The route existed. The planning team 4 time zones away would need to work the specifics, the timing, the element's movement capability, the cordon dynamics. Those were things she could inform, but couldn't control from a conference room in Coronado. She stepped back, and she stood at the edge of the activity and watched, and in her face was something that was hard to name. Not pride exactly, and not satisfaction exactly. Something quieter than both. The particular expression of someone who has done the thing they were built to do, and doesn't need applause for it, and doesn't need acknowledgement for it, and is already in their mind elsewhere. Cole watched her step back. He watched her stand at the edge, while admirals and commanders moved urgently around the table. And something happened in Ryan Cole in that moment that had not happened to him in his 3 years of elite training, in his qualifications, in his high scores, in his instructor commendations, in his proud military family's approval. Something cracked open in him that had been sealed by the particular confidence of a young man who has always been told he is exceptional. He walked to where she was standing. She looked at him. He said, I was wrong about you. You were working with what you had, she said. No, he said. It was important to him that she understand the distinction. I was working with what I assumed. That's different. He looked at the table, then back at her. I assumed that someone without a visible record didn't have a real one. I assumed that competence at this level couldn't exist without a uniform attached to it. He paused. I was wrong in a way that goes beyond yesterday. It's a pattern in how I look at people, and I'm aware of that now in a way I wasn't 48 hours ago. Rebecca looked at him for a moment. That's worth more than the apology, she said quietly. He didn't understand immediately. Then he did. The awareness, he said. The awareness, she confirmed. At 14:17, Grant stepped away from the phone and came back to the table and looked at Rebecca. The planning team incorporated your route, he said. They're running the updated extraction timeline now. Rebecca nodded. They want to know. Grant continued carefully. If you'd be available for a direct consultation call in the next 2 hours. There are terrain questions from the team leader that, yes, she said before he finished. Grant looked at her. Daniel's appointment at 2 hours, she said. His coordinator has it. He doesn't need me for the PT session. The 4:30 call with the neurologist I'll need to be on. She glanced at the clock on the wall. I have time. Grant nodded. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone when he is seeing several things at once, who they are now, who they were, what the distance between those two things cost, and whether the cost was paid correctly. His expression said that he was not sure about the last part and that he was going to carry that uncertainty for a while. Vance came around the table. Howe was carrying himself differently than he had that morning, or even an hour ago. The adjustment was internal, but it showed in external things, the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of his attention, the way he made room for people to occupy space instead of organizing the room around his own presence. He looked at Rebecca. The consultation call, he said, whatever you need, whatever the team needs. He paused. And when it's done, if you're willing, I want to have a different kind of conversation than the one we've been having. What kind? Rebecca asked. About what this base is missing, Vance said, and whether the person who knows what it's missing would consider doing something about it. He said it carefully, leaving room, not assuming. Rebecca looked at him. She didn't say yes, she didn't say no. She said, "Let's get your people home first." And Vance, the Admiral, who had pointed at her in a corridor and laughed, the man who had made her the punchline of a joke in front of an audience. The officer who had not seen her until she made it impossible not to looked at Rebecca Hale and understood something that his rank and his record and his 30 years had not been able to teach him in quite this way before. The quietest person in the room had been carrying something that none of them could have lifted, and she had been doing it alone, without complaint, without announcement, without waiting for anyone to acknowledge that the weight existed, because that had always been the mission, and Night Fox had never once failed to complete the mission. The consultation call began at 14:38, and in the planning facility 4 time zones away, a team leader who had been staring at an impassable ridge for 12 hours listened to a civilian woman's voice describe the southwest drainage channel in specific, practical, ground-level detail, and felt the particular relief of a man whose problem has just become solvable. He didn't know her name. She didn't give it. She gave him what he needed. That was enough. That had always been enough. The consultation call ended at 16:31. Rebecca set the phone down on the conference table and sat for a moment in the particular stillness of someone who has just spent 2 hours inside a problem that demanded everything and is now returning to the surface. Her hands were flat on the table. Her eyes were focused on something that wasn't in the room. Then she blinked and she was back. Grant was watching her from across the table. "They're moving at 2200 local," he said. "The team leader said the route reads exactly as you described it." Rebecca nodded. "He also said to tell you." Grant paused, and something in his expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. "He said to tell you that whoever you are, he owes you a beer." Rebecca looked at Grant. "He doesn't know who I am." "No," Grant said, "he doesn't." "A beat." "Good," she said. Vance had been standing near the window for the last 20 minutes of the call, listening without contributing, which was not a natural posture for him, and which he had maintained with the deliberate discipline of a man who has decided that listening is the correct assignment for this particular hour. He turned now and looked at Rebecca. "The neurologist call," he said. 4:30. "Do you need to leave?" Rebecca checked the clock. 6:38. She looked at her phone. One message from Daniel's care coordinator, timestamped 1:58 p.m., saying that the PT session had gone well and that Daniel had managed the full resistance sequence for the first time without modification. She read it twice. Something crossed her face that was entirely private, not the operational calm, not the professional, neutral, but something that belonged to a sister sitting in a conference room at a naval base who just found out her brother had a good day. It lasted 2 seconds. Then she folded it back and looked up. "I have time," she said. Vance nodded. He looked at Grant. Then he looked at Mercer and Cole, who had been in and out of the room throughout the afternoon, present for enough of it to understand the shape of what had happened, even without the parts they'd been excluded from. "I want everyone here at 1700, Vance said. "I need to say some things." Nobody asked what things. The room understood. 8:59. They were assembled. Vance, Grant, Mercer, Briggs, Cole. And Rebecca, who had used the 20 minutes to call Daniel's coordinator back, confirmed the neurologist's call, details, and eat the second half of the sandwich she had started at 09:12 that morning, standing in the hallway outside the conference room with the patient, practical manner of someone who has learned not to skip meals on long days. She came back in at 1700 exactly. Vance was standing at the head of the table, not seated, standing in the way that people stand when they intend what they're about to say to have weight. He looked at Rebecca first. "I'm going to say this to you directly, and then I'm going to say it publicly tomorrow morning," he said. "And the order matters to me. You hear it first." Rebecca said nothing. She was watching him. "What I did in that corridor yesterday morning was wrong," Vance said. "Not wrong because I didn't know your record. Wrong because I looked at a person and decided based on her clothes and her job title and the fact that she was a woman moving equipment that she was an appropriate target for public humiliation." He stopped. "I used my rank as a weapon against someone who had no ability to respond to it. And I did it in front of an audience, which made it worse because it invited everyone watching to participate." He paused again. "That's not leadership. That's the abuse of it." The room was very quiet. "I could stand here and say I didn't know who you were," Vance continued. "That's true, but it's not a defense. It's exactly the problem. I shouldn't have needed to know your history to treat you with basic dignity. The janitor on this base deserves it. The cook deserves it. The newest enlisted person deserves it. And the woman pushing an equipment cart through Corridor 7 deserves it. He looked at her directly. I failed that, and I'm sorry. Rebecca held his gaze. In the silence that followed, something moved through her face that was for once not managed, not controlled. It was the look of someone being seen fully by someone who had, until very recently, not seen them at all, and finding that the experience is stranger and more affecting than they had expected. Thank you, she said. 2 words. But they were real. Vance nodded. He looked at the rest of the room. Tomorrow morning, 0800, I'm addressing the base. Full formation. What I said in that corridor was public. The correction needs to be public. He looked at Cole specifically when he said this. Cole met his eyes without flinching. Sir, Cole said, I'd like to speak tomorrow as well. Vance looked at him. If that's appropriate, Cole added. It's appropriate, Vance said. Grant, who had been observing all of this with the specific attention of a senior officer watching how people behave when the formal scaffolding has been removed, said quietly from the side of the room. Rebecca, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that the answer no is entirely acceptable. Everyone looked at him. Mercer spoke to me this afternoon, Grant said, while the consultation call was running. He has a proposal. He looked at Mercer. Mercer straightened slightly. He had been thinking about how to phrase this for several hours. He was a precise man who disliked imprecision, and the thing he wanted to say was difficult to make precise because it sat at the intersection of institutional need and personal respect, and those two things didn't always line up cleanly. The Advanced Tactical Training Program here has gaps, Mercer said, not in physical conditioning, not in weapons qualification, in the things that determine whether an operator survives when everything they plan for stops being true. He paused. Decision-making under genuine uncertainty, observation and pattern recognition in ambiguous environments, knowing when to move and when to stay still and how to tell the difference when you have 30 seconds to decide. He looked at Rebecca. Those are things that can be taught. They can be developed, but they have to be taught by someone who has lived them, not someone who has studied them. Rebecca was listening. I'm not asking you to come back, Mercer said carefully. I'm not asking you to take a position that changes your life or your availability to Daniel or anything that matters to you. I'm asking if you'd be willing to consult. Limited hours, your schedule, no deployments, no uniform, no title you don't want. He paused. Just when you can help us teach these men what the manual can't. The room waited. Rebecca looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at Vance. This is your base, she said. What do you want? Vance said. I want you to teach them what respect for the mission actually looks like. Not the performance of it, the substance of it. He paused. I think you're the only person on this installation who can do that right now. And I'm aware of the irony of who's asking. Rebecca almost smiled again. Almost. You're aware of the irony. I'm extremely aware of it, Vance said. A beat. There's a condition, Rebecca said. Name it, Vance said. Nobody calls me Night Fox, she said. I'm not in training, not on base, not in any context related to this role. She looked around the room. My students call me Ms. Hale. That's it. Vance looked at her. Why? Because I don't want them learning from a legend, she said. Legends are things that happen to other people in other times. They're not useful in a room where someone is trying to figure out how to stay alive next year. She paused. I want them learning from mistakes. Mine, theirs. The ones that cost people something. That's what changes the way a person thinks. Vance absorbed that. Done, he said. Grant said, there's one more thing. Everyone looked at him. He reached into the folder, the sealed folder that had been sitting on the table all afternoon, and removed the last page. He looked at it for a moment before he set it down. It was not a mission report. It was not an operational summary. It was a letter handwritten on plain paper. The ink faded at the edges in the way of something that had been folded and unfolded many times. This was in the file when I inherited it, Grant said. It was written by the original program director 8 years before I took oversight. It was addressed to whoever eventually held the file. He paused. I've read it many times. I think Rebecca should have it. He slid it across the table. Rebecca looked at it. She did not reach for it immediately. She looked at it the way you look at something when you're not sure whether you're ready for what it contains. Then she picked it up. She read it. Nobody spoke. She read it twice. The second time more slowly. Her face went through things that the room did not try to read because some things are private even in full view of other people, and the men in this room were collectively experienced enough to know when to look elsewhere. When she set the letter down, her eyes were dry, but something in them had changed, a settling, like something that had been held at a particular angle for a long time had finally been allowed to rest. "What does it say?" Cole asked quietly. Rebecca looked at him. She considered whether to answer. "It says," she said slowly, "that the program was discontinued not because it failed, but because it worked so well that the people running it were afraid of what would happen if the wrong administration found out it existed." She paused. "And it says that the operators who served in it deserve to be acknowledged, and that whoever was reading the letter should make sure they were." She looked at Grant. "You've had this for how long?" "6 years, Grant said. Rebecca looked at him. Grant said, "I know." "You should have." "I know," he said again, more quietly. "There were institutional reasons, classification reasons. None of them," he said, and his voice carried the specific weight of a man being honest about something he has not been entirely proud of, "are good enough." The room absorbed that. Briggs said from his corner in his quiet, flat voice, "What does it say about the operators?" Grant looked at him. "It says they should be found," Grant said, "and thanked, by name, with someone's face attached to the gratitude." He paused. "I'm working on that." Briggs was still. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who has been carrying something a long time and has just been told that the carrying is acknowledged. 8/7/42. Rebecca's phone showed a reminder for the 4:30 neurologist call, which was now 1 a.m., her effective attention span compressed by the longest 48 hours she had experienced outside of active deployment. She looked at the phone. "I need to take this call," she said. "Of course," Vance said. "I go on." She stood. She gathered nothing because she had arrived with nothing except a clipboard that was somewhere in the East Logistics Bay. She looked around the room at Grant, at Mercer, at Briggs, at Cole, at Vance, and she did something that surprised all of them. She looked at them with something that was not distant, not professionally neutral. It was warm in the particular way of someone who does not give warmth easily and means it completely when they do. "Thank you," she said, "not for any single thing. For the accumulation of the last 8 hours." The folder opened, the record acknowledged the apology. Given the route that would bring 6 men home tonight, the letter that had been waiting 6 years to reach its intended recipient. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on it. She turned back and she looked at Vance one more time. "Admiral," she said. "Ms. Hale," he said. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "What you said about the janitor, the cook, the newest recruit." She paused. "Don't let it just be words." Vance held her gaze. "It won't be," he said. She opened the door and walked out. The room held its silence for a moment. Then Cole said, half to himself, staring at the door she'd gone through, "She told us what to be and made it sound simple." Mercer said, "It is simple." "It's not easy," Cole said. "No," Mercer said. "It's not." Vance looked at the closed door. "Get some rest," he said to the room. 0800 tomorrow, everyone." He picked up the sealed folder. He held it for a moment. Then he set it back down on the table because it didn't belong to him and walked out. At 0749 the following morning, Naval Amphibious Base Coronado was assembled. Not informally, not in the partial rotating way that a base gathers for a scheduled administrative event. Fully assembled, every available person on base from senior command staff to the newest support personnel from the SEAL candidates 3 weeks into training to the civilian contractors who work the motor pool and the kitchen and the mailroom and the medical annex. Rebecca was not in the formation. She was standing at the far edge of the assembly area near the equipment building because Vance had told her the formation was happening and had asked her to be present, and she had agreed to be present in the way that she was present for everything, quietly at the edge, where she could see all the exits, and nobody was looking directly at her. She had Daniel's medication schedule in her shirt pocket. She had the worn paperback in her bag. She was wearing the same plain civilian work clothes she wore every day. Vance stepped to the front of the formation at 0800 exactly. He did not have notes. He had thought about this for a long time the previous evening, sitting in his office after everyone had gone, and he had arrived at the conclusion that a man reading from notes while apologizing for treating someone like a punchline was a man who didn't fully understand what he was apologizing for. The words needed to come from the place where the understanding lived, which was not on paper. He looked at the formation. Police said, "Yesterday morning, I stood in a corridor on this base and I pointed at a civilian employee and I made her the subject of a public joke." He did not ease into it. He did not build context or establish the narrative of how it had happened. He said it the way it was. "I did it because she was wearing plain clothes and carrying a logistics badge, and I assumed based on those two facts that she was someone I could afford to make small in front of my men." He paused. "I was wrong, but I want to be very specific about the kind of wrong I was because getting this right matters." The formation was absolutely still. 400 people and no sound. "I was not wrong because she turned out to have an exceptional record," Vance said. "I was not wrong because the person I laughed at happened to be someone who had done remarkable things that I didn't know about." That's not the lesson. He looked out across the formation. "The lesson is that I should not have done it at all to anyone, regardless of their record, regardless of their history, regardless of whether they were a decorated veteran or a person who had never served a day in their life." He stopped. Dignity is not something people earn by revealing their credentials. It is not something that must be established before it is extended. It belongs to every person on this base, in every job, at every level, from the moment they walk through the gate. He looked down for a moment, then back up. "I forgot that. I forgot it publicly in front of people who were watching me for exactly this kind of signal. And the signal I sent was wrong. Not a sound. I'm correcting it publicly," Vance said, "because the disrespect was public, because the people who witnessed it deserve to hear the correction in the same register it was delivered." He paused. "And because the woman it happened to deserves to have someone say in front of the same audience that laughed she was owed better, from the first moment, before anyone knew anything about her." Cole, standing in the officers' section of the formation, was looking at the ground, not in shame, in the specific posture of a man who is listening to something that is landing in him at a level he hadn't expected and is letting it land instead of managing it. Briggs was standing at attention in the senior enlisted section. His face was the face of a man at peace with something that had not been at peace inside him for a long time. Vance said, "Lieutenant Cole is going to speak." Cole stepped forward. He stood at the front of the formation and looked at the 400 people looking back at him, and he did not reach for the professional register he had spent 3 years cultivating. He reached for something less polished and more real. "I'm not going to describe what I saw in the last 2 days," he said. "I'm going to describe what I assumed before I saw it." He paused. "I assumed that if someone was exceptional, I would be able to see it. That excellence comes with visible markers. That someone at the level we aspire to in this program, someone who has earned the kind of respect we give our best operators, would look a certain way, carry themselves a certain way, have a certain kind of presence that announces itself." He stopped. "I was wrong, and I was wrong in the way that's hard to fix because I wasn't wrong about a fact. I was wrong about how I look at people. And that kind of wrong doesn't get corrected by learning one new thing. It gets corrected by changing a habit." He looked out at the formation. "I'm working on it." He stepped back. Vance stepped forward again. "That's all," he said. Dismissed. The formation broke. And in the quiet that followed the movement of 400 people returning to their morning, a base had been changed, not dramatically, not in the way that makes the news or generates a citation. Changed in the way that the interior of a place changes when the people inside it decide collectively to be honest about something they got wrong. At 0847, Cole found Rebecca near the East Equipment Bay. She was back at work. She had her clipboard. She was working through a morning inventory with the same steady, unhurried efficiency that had started everything 2 days ago. Cole watched her for a moment before he walked over. She heard him coming. Of course she did, but she let him close the distance before she looked up. "Ms. Hale," he said. "Lieutenant," she said. He stood there for a moment with the particular awkwardness of a young man who has said something true in public and is now standing in front of the person the truth was about and doesn't entirely know what comes next. "What you said yesterday," he started, "about being responsible for becoming someone worth trusting." He paused. "I've been thinking about that." "Good," Rebecca said simply. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and you don't have to answer." She waited. "Was there a moment in your career when you understood what it actually meant? Not the version of it they teach you in training, but the real version, the one that costs something." Rebecca looked at him for a moment. She set the clipboard down on the edge of the cart. There was an operation, she said. I was 28. I had been in the program for 3 years, and I was good at what I did, and I knew I was good at it, which is a dangerous place to be. She paused. I made a decision on a route selection that I was confident in, and I was right about the route. But I was wrong about the timing because I was prioritizing my own right of the situation over information that was available to me from a source I had privately decided was less reliable than I was. She stopped. The timing error cost us 40 minutes. In those 40 minutes, the element I was supporting moved into a position they couldn't exit safely before daylight. She looked at Cole directly. Nobody died, but they spent 14 hours in a position they shouldn't have been in because I trusted my own certainty more than I trusted the available data. She picked up the clipboard. After that, I stopped being interested in being right. I started being interested in the men coming home. Cole was very still. The difference between those two things, he said slowly, being right versus bringing people home. Sometimes they're the same, Rebecca said. When they're not, you have to know which one you're choosing. Cole looked at her. How do you know which one you're choosing? He asked. You ask yourself who pays for the choice, Rebecca said. If the answer is you, if the cost lands on you, it's probably fine. If the answer is the person standing next to you, then the question isn't whether you're right. The question is whether being right is worth what it costs them. Cole absorbed that. He looked at the equipment cart, at the clipboard, at the plain clothes and the logistics badge. You've been asking yourself that question every day, he said, about Daniel. Rebecca looked at him. She didn't confirm it. She didn't need to. Every single day, Cole said quietly, not a question anymore. Rebecca picked up the handle of the equipment cart. Good morning, Lieutenant, she said. He stepped on someone. She moved past him and continued down the corridor. He watched her go. And something in Ryan Cole, the part that had spent 3 years building a version of excellence that could be seen and measured and put on a record, quietly and permanently revised itself. At 1100, Vance received confirmation from the operations center. The extraction had succeeded. All 6 members of the reconnaissance element had been recovered through the southwest drainage channel that Rebecca had identified from a satellite image in a conference room in Coronado. They had moved through the route in 4 hours and 40 minutes, reached the extraction point 11 minutes ahead of the revised timeline, and had been confirmed safe at 0423 local time. Nobody was injured. Nobody was left behind. Vance stood in the operations center and looked at the confirmation message for a long time. Then he called Grant. She saved them, he said. Grant was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. She found the route, Grant said carefully. The element moved it. The pilots flew it. The planners built the timeline. A pause. That's the part she would want you to understand. Vance looked at the message. She would push back on taking credit, he said. She always has, Grant said. How do you give someone credit for something they refuse to take credit for? Vance asked. Grant said, you build what they built. You teach what they taught. You treat people the way they've demonstrated people should be treated. A beat. You become the institution that deserved to have someone like her. Vance held the phone for a moment. She said something before she left yesterday, he said. She said, don't let it be just words. She was right, Grant said. I know, Vance said. He ended the call. He stood in the operations center for a moment longer. Then he walked out and down the corridor, corridor 7, the one that had started everything 2 days ago, and he walked its length at the pace of a man paying attention to where he was. At the far end, Rebecca was finishing the last inventory sheet of her morning run. She was signing the bottom of the form, her handwriting small, and even the pen moving with the same economy as everything else she did. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. Admiral, she said, Miss Hale? He stopped a few feet away. They're home. Something shifted in her face, quick, quiet, complete. All 6, he said. She looked down at the inventory sheet for a moment. Then she looked back up. Good, she said. The word was simple and small and carried everything. Vance nodded. He started to turn away. Then he stopped. He turned back. I want to ask you something, he said. She waited. That morning, in the corridor, when I asked for your call sign and the room laughed, he held her gaze. Why didn't you say anything? You could have ended it. One sentence and the whole thing stops. Rebecca looked at him. She was quiet for a moment. Because respect that depends on knowing someone's resume, she said, isn't respect. Vance stood with that. You wanted to know if we had it before we knew, he said slowly. I wasn't testing you, she said. I was just standing there. But you noticed. I always notice, she said simply. That doesn't mean it's a test. It just means it's information. Vance looked at her. And what was the information, he said. Rebecca looked at him for a long moment. That this base has good men in it, she said. Men who can change, men who can hear something hard and let it land instead of defending against it. She paused. Lieutenant Cole, Mercer, Briggs. She looked at Vance directly. You. He held her gaze. She picked up her cart. Same time tomorrow, she said. And she pushed the cart back down Corridor 7 past the overhead lights and the equipment bays and the plain institutional walls, and she did not look back. Vance stood in this corridor and watched her go. He watched her until she turned the corner, and in the quiet she left behind, he understood something about leadership that 30 years of commands and decorations and authority had been building toward without quite arriving at. The best thing a leader could do was not to be the most important person in the room. It was to make sure the most important person in the room felt safe enough to keep showing up. He turned and walked back toward his office. And somewhere on base in a physical therapy facility, 12 minutes away, a 31-year-old man named Daniel Hale was doing his afternoon exercises and thinking about his sister, who had been working long days this week and hadn't said much about why, which meant it was something she was carrying, the way she always carried things quietly, completely and alone, until it was done. He didn't know about the corridor. He didn't know about the folder. I didn't know about the 6 men who had come home through a route his sister found in a satellite image at a conference table. He just knew that when she got home tonight, she would make dinner and ask about his PT and pretend she wasn't tired, and he would pretend not to notice that she was, and between the two of them, they would hold the shape of normal until it became true again. That was what she did. That was what she had always done. Night Fox had never needed anyone to see her. She had only ever needed the mission to succeed, and tonight it had. 3 weeks passed. The base settled back into its rhythms, the way bases do training, cycles, rotation schedules, the daily machinery of an institution that does not pause for its own interior reckonings. The formation speech became the kind of thing people referenced obliquely in the way that significant events get absorbed into the culture of a place without being constantly named. Vance had said what he said. Cole had said what he said. And the base had returned to work, carrying the weight of it, quietly the way people carry things that have genuinely landed. Rebecca returned to work the morning after the formation and did not treat anything differently. That was in its own way the most instructive thing she did. She arrived at 0610. She completed her inventory runs. She signed her sheets. She answered logistics emails with the same brief, precise responses she had always written. She ate lunch in the break room adjacent to the loading dock. She left in time to manage Daniel's afternoon schedule. She did not walk differently through the corridors. She did not acknowledge the glances that followed her. Now, not with satisfaction, not with discomfort, simply not at all in the way of someone who has never organized their sense of self around being observed. But things had changed. They had changed in the small structural ways that matter more than the visible ones. The young SEAL candidates who passed her in the corridors said good morning now, not with the performance of men demonstrating that they had learned a lesson, but with the natural register of people who had recalibrated what the person in front of them represented. Mercer stopped her twice in the first week to ask specific questions about training scenarios he was developing, and both times he listened to her answers with the complete attention of a man receiving information from a primary source. Even the duty officers at the logistics desk, who had processed her paperwork for 8 months without looking up from their screens, began meeting her eyes when she came in. None of it was dramatic. All of it was real. On a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week, Cole found her in Training Bay 4. She was there early before any scheduled session, standing at the equipment table with a training scenario layout spread in front of her. She had been given a key to the bay as part of the informal advisory arrangement Mercer had negotiated. She used it sparingly and only before or after regular hours because she was precise about not making her presence larger than it needed to be. Cole had come in early for a personal training session and had not expected to find her there. He stopped in the doorway. She didn't look up. "Come in, Lieutenant. I can hear you breathing." He came in. He looked at the scenario layout on the table. It was a room-clearing problem, but the architecture of it was unlike anything in the standard training library. The entry points were wrong, intentional wrong in ways that would force the clearing team to adapt in real time instead of executing a memorized sequence. "What is this?" he asked. "Next week's advanced session," she said. "If Mercer approves it." "He'll approve it." Cole studied the layout. "This entrance angle, that's a trap." "Yes. You want them to walk into it." "I want them to recognize it before they walk into it," she said. "And if they don't recognize it, I want them to adapt after they're in it instead of freezing." She pointed to a secondary position on the layout. "Most of the current curriculum assumes the first read of a space is accurate. Real environments lie. This one lies 3 times." Cole looked at the layout for a long moment. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You're going to regardless," she said, which was not unkind. He almost smiled. "The operation you described, when you were 28, the one where you prioritized your own read over the available data." He paused. "How long did it take before you forgave yourself for it?" Rebecca looked up from the layout. She looked at him with the specific attention of someone hearing a question they were not expecting from a direction they were not watching. "What makes you think I did?" she said. Cole was quiet. "I don't mean that the way it sounds," she said. She straightened. "I mean the goal wasn't forgiveness. The goal was to not repeat it. Forgiveness is something you give yourself so you can move on. Not repeating it is something you do so the people next to you don't pay for your learning curve again." She paused. "I chose the second one." Cole absorbed that. "That sounds like a harder way to live," he said. "It's a more honest one," she said. Cole looked at the scenario layout again. "My father was a Marine," he said. It came out slightly sideways, not quite connected to what they'd been talking about in the way that important things sometimes arrive. 22 years, he never talked about his deployments, ever. I grew up thinking that was strength, that the ability to not need to talk about it was part of what made him who he was." Rebecca waited. "I think I understand now that it wasn't strength," Cole said. "I think it was just the only way he knew to carry it. And I think I absorbed that as a model and built a version of it that was actually just," he stopped, "armor, that I called discipline." Rebecca looked at him. "Your father carried his people home," she said. "Yeah," Cole said, "he did." "Then he understood the mission," she said. "The carrying it quietly, that's not a flaw. That's the cost. You just have to know what it is so you don't charge it to the wrong account." Cole looked at her. "The wrong account," he repeated. "The people around you," she said simply. "When you don't know you're carrying something, it doesn't disappear. It just comes out sideways, in how you treat people who don't meet your standard, in what you assume about someone based on what they're wearing." She held his gaze. "The armor becomes a weapon." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight in it. Cole looked at the scenario layout. "He would have liked you," he said finally. Rebecca looked back at her work. "Get your training done, Lieutenant," she said. He went to the far side of the bay and he began his session, and Rebecca returned to the scenario layout, making small adjustments with her pencil, building a problem that would be hard enough to hurt and honest enough to teach. At 09:12 on a Thursday morning, 4 weeks after Q7, Vance stopped her outside the logistics office. I was not in a hurry. That was the first thing she noticed. He had the body language of a man who had made time for a specific thing, not a man conducting incidental conversation. "Grant called me this morning," he said. Rebecca waited. "The 6 men from the extraction," Vance said. "The element leader. He's been pushing command for 3 weeks to find out who consulted on the road." He paused. Grant held the line. "But the element leader is persistent," is one word for it. "What does he want?" Rebecca asked. "To say thank you," Vance said. Rebecca looked at him. "No," she said. "Rebecca." "No," she said again, not loudly, not sharply. The flat final no of someone who has considered this position thoroughly and is not approaching it as a negotiation. What he experienced is his. What his team went through is theirs. A thank you to me makes it about me, and it was never about me. They moved the route, they trusted their training. They made the decisions that got them out. She paused. I looked at a map. Vance studied her. "You can't accept gratitude," he said. It wasn't quite an accusation, it was an observation from someone trying to understand a pattern. "I can accept it from people I actually had a relationship with," she said. "People I trained beside, people who knew I was there." She met his eyes. "A stranger's gratitude for something he doesn't fully know. I did for a mission that's classified in a context that would require me to be something I've deliberately stopped being. No. She paused. He came home. His team came home. That's enough. That's the whole thing. Vance was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Briggs said something to me yesterday. She waited. He said that for 22 years, not knowing the name of the person who brought his team home was the hardest part. Vance said, not the mission, not the years since, the not knowing. He paused. He said it's easier now, not because anything changed in the past, because he knows the present. Something moved through Rebecca's face. How is he? She said. And the question was quiet and genuine in a way that most of her questions were not. It came from the part of her that had not been professionalized, the part that remembered always, that operators were people. He's good, Vance said. He's been sitting in on the advisory sessions you've been running. He doesn't say much, but he takes notes. Vance almost smiled. On paper. He refuses to use a tablet. Rebecca looked down at the inventory sheet in her hand. Tell him he doesn't need to take notes, she said. He already knows everything I'm teaching. He just needs to remember he knows it. Vance looked at her. I'll tell him. He started to leave. Admiral, she said. He turned back. The element leader, she said. Tell Grant to tell him it was a team effort. Multiple people, multiple sources. Nobody singular. She paused. That's accurate, and it's enough. Vance nodded slowly. It's also exactly what you would say, whether it was accurate or not, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said, it is. She went back to her inventory sheet. He walked away, understanding something about her that he hadn't understood before, that her humility was not performance, and it was not modesty in the social sense. It was a structural thing built into how she understood what a mission was. The mission was never the individual. The individual was the vehicle. The mission was the people who came home. She had organized her entire professional identity around that distinction. And when the professional identity had ended, she had simply applied the same logic to Daniel. The mission was Daniel. Everything else was vehicle. On a Friday afternoon, 6 weeks after the formation, Briggs knocked on the open door of the training bay where Rebecca was reviewing scenario notes. She looked up. I was in civilian clothes, unusual for him, though he was technically off duty. He had a thermos in one hand and the expression of a man who has been deciding for several days whether to have a particular conversation. Got a minute, he said. Sit down, Master Chief, she said. He sat across from her at the table, set the thermos down, and looked at her with the direct, undecorated attention of a man who has decided to say the true thing. I've been in those sessions, he said, sitting in the back. I know, she said. The way you teach, he said. It's not what I expected. She waited. I expected tactics, he said, applications. The practical version of what you know. He paused. But you spend more time on the decisions before the tactics than on the tactics themselves. The decision is where it's won or lost, she said. The tactics are just the execution. The candidates don't always understand that, he said. Not yet, she said. That's why they're here. Briggs turned the thermos in his hands. Red Valley, he said, the name, again. But different now than the first time, less of a test, less of a revelation. More like the name of a place two people had both been said between them as acknowledgement. Red Valley, she confirmed. I've thought about that night for 22 years, he said. Tried to reconstruct it. Tried to understand the route you chose. I've run the terrain in my head probably 1,000 times, he looked at her. How did you know the second checkpoint was clear? We were moving blind. You told us the checkpoint was clear before we reached it. We had no confirmation. I never understood how you knew. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Set her pencil down. I didn't know, she said. Briggs stared. I assessed, she said. I had been watching the position for 4 hours. I had the movement pattern. I had the rotation timing. I had a read on the fatigue level of the personnel based on behavioral indicators I won't bore you with. She paused. I assessed that the checkpoint was clear with high confidence. Not certainty, high confidence. She looked at him directly. If I'd been wrong, you'd have walked into it. Briggs absorbed that. You assessed, he said slowly. The best decision available with the information available in the time available, she said. That's all any of it ever is. Briggs was quiet for a long time. 22 years, I've been thinking there was something. He stopped, started again. Some ability I didn't have. Some level of certainty you were operating at that I couldn't access. He looked at her, and it was assessment. Experienced assessment, she said. Disciplined assessment. Assessment built on thousands of hours of developing the ability to read a situation accurately under pressure. She paused. That's not a small thing, but it's a learnable thing. It's a practicable thing. She met his eyes. Which is why I'm in that training bay 3 mornings a week. Briggs looked at her. Then he did something she did not expect. He laughed. Not the polite laugh of a social moment. A real one, the laugh of a man who has had a knot in something for a very long time and has just felt it release. It was short and genuine, and it changed his face completely. 22 years, he said. Were they good years, she asked. He looked at her. Yeah, he said. They were. Then the assessment was right, she said. He laughed again, softer this time. They sat for a moment in the comfortable quiet of two people who have established something between them that doesn't need more words. Then Briggs said, why did you really stay after separation? Why Coronado specifically? Rebecca looked at her scenario notes. Daniel's facility is 12 minutes away, she said. That's the practical reason, Briggs said. She looked up at him. He held her gaze with the patience of a man who has time and intention and is not going to fill the silence for her. She said, because I'm not finished. Briggs was still. Not with the work, she said. I know that part is done. I know I'm not going back. She paused. But there are things I know, things I learned at a cost that I didn't pay alone. And if I take those things with me when I leave and they die with me, then the cost wasn't worth what it bought. She looked at the scenario layout on the table. These men, the ones in that training bay, some of them are going to be somewhere someday when everything that was planned stops being true. And if something I showed them in a Thursday morning session gives one of them the half second he needs to make the right call. She stopped. Then the accounting is right. Then the cost paid for something. Briggs looked at her for a long time. That's why Night Fox, he said quietly. She looked at him. You were never trying to be seen, he said. You were trying to make sure the people you worked with made it home. And now you're here because the people you work with, different people, same principle, are going to need to make it home. He paused. Different mission, same Night Fox. Rebecca looked at him. Something in her face was very still and very open. At the same time, the way a person's face gets in the moment before they say something true that they have not said out loud before. My team leader, she said, the first one, when I was new to the program and thought I understood what I was doing. She paused. He told me something that I have thought about almost every day since. Briggs waited. He said the mark of the mission isn't what you did. It's who came home. She looked at the table. I spent 11 years measuring every operation by that. Every decision, every route, every call, made in the dark with incomplete information measured against who came home. She looked up. Daniel came home. He came home changed, and it's hard, and there are days he's frustrated in ways that break my heart. But he's here. He's working. He's fighting for it every day. Her voice was steady. It had always been steady, but there was something underneath the steadiness now that was audible. And the men in that training bay, I want them to come home, to their families, to their lives, whatever comes after. She paused. That's the mission. Briggs looked at her. He said, he was lucky, your team leader, to have you. I was lucky, she said, to have the mission. They sat together for another minute. Then Briggs stood, picked up his thermos and said, same time next week. I'll be in the back. You don't have to take notes, she said. I know, he said, but I like having something to do with my hands. He walked out, and Rebecca sat alone in the training bay with her scenario layout and her pencil in the particular Friday afternoon quiet of a base winding toward the end of its week, and she felt for the first time in a long time that the accounting was clean. On a morning in the 8th week, Vance encountered Rebecca in corridor 7. Not by arrangement, not by design. The same corridor, the same overhead lights, the same equipment, bays off to the sides. Rebecca with a logistics case. Vance with a group of officers heading toward the operations center. The group was mid-conversation when they rounded the corner. Vance saw her. She saw him. The officers around him continued talking. And Vance did something unremarkable that was in the specific context of the last 8 weeks, the most significant thing he had done. He smiled, not the entertained, performing smile of a man working a room. The smile of a person greeting someone they respect in the genuine, uncomplicated way of people who have earned something real between them. "Morning, Ms. Hale," he said. "Morning, Admiral," she said. He kept walking. She kept walking. The officers around him continued their conversation, unaware that the two people who had just exchanged 11 words were standing on the other side of one of the more significant 8-week periods either of them had experienced in a long time. But then Vance stopped. His officers took 2 steps past him before they noticed and stopped too. He turned back. "Rebecca," he said. She turned. "Sir." He looked at her across the corridor. "I think I finally understand your call sign," he said. She raised an eyebrow, just slightly. "Night Fox," he said quietly, low enough that only she could hear it. "You were never trying to be seen." "No, sir," she said. "You were trying to make sure everybody else made it home." Rebecca held his gaze. For a moment, the corridor was very still around them. The overhead lights, the institutional walls, the base moving through its day, on all sides of this 12-second pause that would not appear in any record or report. Then she said, "That's the whole job." Vance nodded. He turned back to his officers. He walked toward the operations center. He did not look back. Rebecca picked up her logistics case and continued toward the transport bay. No applause, no ceremony. No one watching who understood what had just been said. Just a woman going back to work. At 15:45 that afternoon, Rebecca got into her car and drove 12 minutes to the rehabilitation facility where Daniel was finishing his physical therapy session. She signed in at the front desk. She walked to the PT room door and looked through the window at her brother, who was working the resistance band sequence, with his left arm jaw set focused, refusing the modification the therapist offered. She watched him for a moment. He looked up and saw her through the window. He raised his right hand, a wave. Small and simple and entirely without self-consciousness. The wave of a person who is glad to see the person they're looking at. She raised her hand back. She waited. When he came out 15 minutes later, slightly tired and slightly triumphant in the way he was after a good session, she handed him the water bottle she had brought from home, and they walked to the car, and she asked how it went. "Better," he said. "Left side's getting there." "It is," she said. They drove. Daniel looked out the window for a moment. "Heard you had an interesting week a while back," he said. She glanced at him. "The base," he said. "People talk. My coordinator knows the duty officer's sister or something. You know how it goes." "What did you hear?" she said carefully. "That some admiral made a joke at your expense," he said, "and that it didn't go well for him." Rebecca drove. "Something like that," she said. Daniel looked at her. "You okay?" he said. "I'm fine," she said. "You sure, Daniel?" "I'm just asking." "I'm fine," she said. "It was handled." He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked back out the window. "You should have let the case fall," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the window. She looked back at the road, and then she laughed. Not the almost smile, not the controlled, fractional warmth she offered in professional contexts. A real laugh, quick and genuine, the laugh of someone surprised out of their own gravity by something perfectly exactly right. Daniel looked at her with the expression of a man deeply satisfied with himself. "There it is," he said. "You're impossible," she said. "You love me," he said. "I work very hard for you," she said. Same thing he said. They drove home through the California afternoon, the two of them in the worn Honda that had made this trip 5 days a week for 3 years, the medication schedule in her shirt pocket, in the paperback in her bag, and the next day's inventory sheets waiting on her desk at home. Just 2 people going home. That evening in the Naval Special Warfare Command's classified archives, 43 pages of sealed operational record sat in a folder under a designation that very few people in the American military had ever been authorized to read. The missions were still classified. The routes were still sealed. The names of the people who had come home were still protected by the same institutional machinery that had for 11 years protected the woman who had helped bring them there. But in Training Bay 4, a scenario layout with 3 deliberate lies built into the architecture was waiting for a group of SEAL candidates who would arrive at 0700 the following Thursday and discover for the first time that the environment was not going to cooperate with their expectations, and they were going to have to adapt. And the woman who had built the scenario was going to stand at the back of the room and watch them figure out that the first read of a space is not always accurate. and that the decision is where it's won or lost, and that the mission is not what you did, but who came home. She was going to teach them the thing the manual could not teach. Not because she needed them to know her name, not because she needed them to know her history. Because someday, in some place where everything planned had stopped being true, one of them was going to need a half second of the right instinct, and she was going to make sure they had it. That was Night Fox, not the woman who wanted everyone to know what she had done. The woman who made sure that when it mattered most, the people beside her knew what to do. The quietest person in the room carries the heaviest history. Rank commands obedience. Reputation commands attention. But character built in silence, tested in the dark. Measured only by who comes home, character is what commands everything else. And in Quarter 7, on a base that had learned to see differently, a logistics badge still hung on a plain civilian shirt, moving through the day exactly as it always had. Unhurried, unannounced, completely, utterly, and permanently itself. Night Fox had never needed the world to know her name. She had only ever needed the mission to succeed, and it had, every single time.